On a quiet street in suburban Atlanta, a story of forbidden love and deadly consequences unfolded, leaving a family shattered and a community stunned. This is the tragic tale of Hannah Miller, a devout Christian wife who made a mistake that would cost her everything. Set between 2000 and 2015, the story explores the dark secrets that led to a violent end. Hannah Miller's early life in rural Georgia shaped her into a woman of deep faith and strong values. Born in 1980, she grew up in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other. Her parents were devout Christians who emphasized the importance of church, family, and the principles of loyalty and devotion. The church was the center of their world, and from a young age, Hannah was taught to live according to these values. She was known for her kind heart and her unwavering commitment to doing what was right. As a young girl, Hannah dreamed of a simple, happy life. She envisioned herself growing up, marrying a good Christian man, and starting a family of her own. Her faith was her guide, and she believed that if she followed the teachings she had grown up with, everything would fall into place. However, life was about to test her in ways she never expected. In 2003, when Hannah was 23 years old, she attended a church function that would change the course of her life. It was at this event that she met Paul Miller, a handsome and charismatic man, a few years older than her. Paul was confident, with a magnetic presence that made people gravitate toward him. At the time, Paul was dealing with the collapse of his first serious relationship, a breakup that left him emotionally vulnerable. He found himself drawn to Hannah, who represented a sense of stability and comfort. Hannah, though deeply committed to her faith, couldn't deny the connection she felt with Paul. They spent more time together under the guise of church activities, and as days passed, the lines blurred. Their shared moments grew more intimate, and before long they found themselves in the midst of a brief but intense affair. Both were racked with guilt afterward, knowing that what they had done went against everything they believed in. Paul, being older and more experienced, pushed the affair aside, convincing himself it was just a mistake. But for Hannah, the shame lingered. She carried the weight of their actions quietly, never speaking of it again, and trying to bury the memories deep within. By then, she had no idea that Paul would soon become a permanent part of her life, in ways she could never have anticipated. Later that same year, Hannah met Sam Miller. He was Paul's younger brother, though she didn't realize it at first. Sam had a kindness about him that immediately attracted her. Unlike Paul's fiery intensity, Sam had a calming presence that made Hannah feel safe. As they grew closer, she discovered that Sam came from the same strong Christian background she did, and their shared faith became the foundation of their relationship. It wasn't until she met his family that the shocking truth hit her. Paul was Sam's brother. Hannah and Paul shared a moment of silent panic when they realized the delicate situation they were now in. Everything they had done in the past could unravel in an instant, threatening to destroy the new life Hannah had begun to build with Sam. After a brief, tense conversation, both agreed to keep their secret buried forever. They swore to never let it out, convinced that what had happened between them was a mistake that should remain in the past. In 2005, Sam and Hannah were married. Their wedding was a beautiful sun-soaked day, and to all the guests who attended, the couple seemed like the perfect match. But behind the smiles and the vows, Hannah carried a secret that gnawed at her conscience. She threw herself into her marriage, determined to be the devoted wife she had always dreamed of being, pushing thoughts of Paul further into the recesses of her mind. As the years went by, Sam flourished in his career, and the couple settled into a comfortable life. They attended church regularly, and to the outside world, they were the epitome of a Christian family. But Paul's life took a different turn. After several failed relationships and mounting financial issues, Paul began to spiral. His envy of Sam's success and happiness grew, and with that envy came a renewed interest in Hannah. By 2010, Paul's jealousy had turned into something darker. He couldn't stand watching his younger brother live the life he had once fantasized about with Hannah. The more he saw them together, the more he regretted letting her go all those years ago. What had once been a moment of weakness was now, in his mind, an opportunity he had squandered. This obsession drove Paul to make a decision that would ultimately lead to disaster. On August 11th, 2012, the police discovered Hannah's body after a neighbor reported hearing a disturbance. The investigation quickly revealed a trail of evidence linking Paul to the crime. On August 13th, 2012, Paul was brought in for questioning, but he denied any involvement, claiming he hadn't seen Hannah in days. However, forensic evidence from the crime scene and the recovered footage of their affair painted a different story. Back in 2010, Paul approached Hannah with a proposition: rekindle their affair. Hannah was horrified at the suggestion, but Paul wasn't the same man he had been years earlier. He was no longer willing to let things go easily. He threatened her, reminding her of their secret and the damage it could do if Sam ever found out. Hannah, desperate to protect her marriage and the life she had built, resisted, but Paul was persistent, and over time, the pressure mounted. He demanded that she meet him one more time, convincing her that this would be the last. Hannah, torn between fear and guilt, reluctantly agreed. This meeting, in late 2010, was a turning point. Hannah believed it would be the end, but for Paul, it was just the beginning. What she didn't know was that Paul had secretly recorded their encounter, using it as leverage to further manipulate her. When he later revealed the footage to her, Hannah's world began to unravel. She was trapped, her past catching up with her in the most painful way. Hannah's emotional turmoil became too much to bear. She began to distance herself from Sam, unable to look him in the eye. Her faith, once her guiding light, now felt like a heavy burden as she wrestled with the choices she had made. The guilt was overwhelming, but more than that, she was terrified of what Paul might do next. This series of events set the stage for a tragic and violent confrontation, one that would lead to devastating consequences for everyone involved. What began as a secret buried in the past was now a ticking time bomb, ready to explode and destroy the lives of those it touched. On the night of June 20th, 2012, the tension in Hannah's mind was unbearable. She had spent days agonizing over Paul's persistent demands. His threats had become more intense, and she felt as though she had no escape. As she drove to Paul's house, her heart raced with dread. She was convinced this would be the last time that she could somehow put an end to this nightmare. Deep inside, Hannah knew she was making a mistake, but the fear of losing everything, her husband, her family, her life as she knew it, clouded her judgment. When she arrived at Paul's house, there was an eerie silence in the air. Paul greeted her with a smugness that made her stomach churn. He acted as though he was in control of the situation, confident that she had no choice but to comply with his wishes. Hannah felt powerless. The weight of her guilt and shame crushed her as she walked inside, knowing she was betraying Sam once again. Unbeknownst to her, Paul had hidden a camera in the room, ready to record every moment. To him, this was insurance, a way to hold on to control long after this night was over. Hannah, oblivious to the camera, was focused only on getting through the night and ending this toxic cycle for good. In the days that followed, Hannah's guilt consumed her. She tried to move on, pretending everything was normal at home with Sam. But inside, she was falling apart. Paul, however, was far from finished. A few days later, he sent Hannah the footage of their encounter. The moment she saw the video, her world collapsed. It felt like a vice tightening around her, choking her with fear and regret. Paul's message was clear: continue seeing him, or the video would be sent to Sam. Hannah's faith, which had once been her guiding light, now felt like a distant memory. She prayed for strength, but the shame was too heavy. Every time she looked at Sam, her heart ached with guilt. She was a devoted wife, but now she was living a lie, one that could destroy her marriage at any moment. The weight of the secret became unbearable. Over the next few weeks, Hannah's behavior began to change. She grew distant, avoiding Sam's questions about what was troubling her. She couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. She feared his reaction, knowing it would devastate him. But more than that, she feared losing him forever. Sam had always been the rock in her life, the one person who made her feel safe. The thought of breaking his heart filled her with dread. As the weeks passed, Hannah's emotional distance from Sam only grew. She began to withdraw from the life they had built together, spending hours alone, lost in thought. Her once warm and loving nature turned cold. Sam, sensing that something was deeply wrong, tried to reach out. But every time he asked her what was going on, she pushed him away. The tension in the house grew thicker with each passing day. On August 5th, 2012, After weeks of unbearable pressure, Hannah could no longer carry the burden. She had spent countless nights awake, tossing and turning, consumed by the guilt that weighed on her soul. She knew she couldn't keep the secret any longer. It was tearing her apart. So, on that fateful day, she made the decision to confess everything to Sam. The moment Hannah revealed the truth, Sam's world shattered. The man who had built his life on trust, love, and faith suddenly found himself standing on broken ground. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever imagined. He had trusted Hannah with his heart, and now that trust was in pieces. Sam's anger was immediate and fierce. His faith had taught him forgiveness, but in that moment, all he could feel was rage. He called her a liar and questioned everything they had shared. Overcome with the enormity of the betrayal, Sam stormed out of the house. He couldn't stay. The walls that had once been filled with love and warmth now felt suffocating, tainted by Hannah's actions. He needed time to think, to process what had happened. For days, Sam disappeared, leaving Hannah alone in their house, filled with regret and fear of what might come next. Every day that passed without word from him felt like an eternity, and she feared that she had lost him for good. While Sam was away, trying to make sense of everything, Paul saw an opportunity. He was emboldened by the chaos he had created. His jealousy had transformed into a twisted sense of triumph. With Sam out of the picture, Paul believed he could take control once more. He went to Hannah's house, demanding to see her. His arrogance was palpable as he insisted she continue the affair. To him it was clear she had no choice. Hannah, however, was no longer the same woman who had been consumed by guilt and fear. She had already lost so much, and the thought of losing more was unbearable. She stood her ground, refusing Paul's advances, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. His obsession with her had spiraled out of control. He believed that in the end he could force her to stay with him. His desperation was dangerous, and the tension between them was about to reach a boiling point. What had started as a secret buried in the past was now unraveling, setting the stage for the violent confrontation that would soon follow. Paul's manipulation, Hannah's guilt, and Sam's heartbreak were converging into a tragic moment that would change their lives forever. On the night of August 10th, 2012, the tension that had been building between Hannah and Paul finally exploded into violence. Paul had been drinking heavily, stewing in his own jealousy and anger. The alcohol only intensified his emotions, pushing him to a breaking point. He couldn't stand the idea of losing control over Hannah, especially now that she had confessed everything to Sam. In Paul's mind, this was his last chance to keep her for himself, to somehow force her back into the affair. His obsession had spiraled out of control, and he was willing to do whatever it took to regain his grip on her life. As he arrived at the house that night, Paul was filled with a mixture of rage and desperation. He pounded on the door, demanding to see Hannah. Inside, Hannah was alone, waiting anxiously for Sam to return. When she opened the door and saw Paul standing there, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. His eyes were wild, his voice slurred with anger. He demanded that they continue the affair, insisting that she had no other choice. Hannah, by now, was emotionally exhausted. The past few months had drained her of everything: her faith, her marriage, and now her safety. She told Paul that it was over, that she had confessed to Sam and no longer wanted to live in fear of the truth. But Paul refused to accept it. In his mind, Hannah's confession had ruined everything. He blamed her for destroying the life they had secretly shared, and his frustration boiled over. What happened next was a blur of chaos and violence. Paul lunged at Hannah, grabbing her by the arms, trying to force himself on her. Hannah screamed, struggling to break free, pushing him away with all the strength she had left. She fought back, her mind racing as she realized the danger she was in. Paul had never been like this before. He had always been manipulative and controlling, but now he was violent, out of control. In the struggle, Hannah managed to strike Paul in the groin, a desperate move to escape his grasp. He let out a grunt of pain, and for a moment she thought she had a chance. She broke free and ran toward the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Paul stumbling behind her, still furious and intent on controlling her. Hannah's only thought was to get away, to escape the madness that had taken over the man she once thought she knew. But as she reached the kitchen, Paul, blinded by rage, grabbed a knife from the counter. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. In a fit of anger, he threw the knife toward her. Time seemed to slow down as the blade flew through the air, striking Hannah in the back of the head. She collapsed instantly, her body crumpling to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Paul stood there, frozen in shock, as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Hannah lay motionless on the cold kitchen floor, her life taken in an instant. The woman who had once been filled with hope, who had dedicated herself to her family and her faith, was gone. Paul, now sober with the weight of his actions, panicked. He hadn't intended for this to happen, but in his rage, he had killed her. He fled the scene, leaving behind the horrific evidence of his crime, his mind racing with fear and regret. The next day, on August 11th, 2012, the quiet neighborhood was disrupted by the sound of police sirens. A neighbor, having heard the commotion the night before, had called the authorities. When the police entered the house, they were greeted with a grisly scene. Hannah's body lay on the kitchen floor, surrounded by blood. The knife that had ended her life nearby. The once peaceful home was now a crime scene, filled with the echoes of violence and betrayal. The investigation began immediately. Detectives combed through the house, gathering evidence, trying to piece together what had happened. It didn't take long for them to connect the dots. Paul had been seen at the house the night before, and the trail of evidence quickly led to him. On August 13th, 2012, Paul was brought in for questioning. He denied everything at first, claiming that he hadn't seen Hannah in days. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic analysis of the scene combined with the recovered footage of their previous affair, painted a clear picture of Paul's motive and his actions on that fateful night. By August 20th, 2012, the police had gathered enough evidence to arrest Paul for Hannah's murder. The arrest sent fear and panic through the community. Friends and family, who had once viewed the Millers as the perfect Christian couple, now struggled to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. Paul, who had once been a respected member of the church, was now seen as a monster, consumed by jealousy and rage. As the trial approached, the tension in the community grew. On September 15th, 2013, the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see justice served. Paul's trial for the murder of Hannah Miller was a media sensation, with local news outlets covering every detail. The prosecution argued that Paul's jealousy and obsession with Hannah had driven him to commit the crime, while the defense tried to portray the incident as a tragic accident during a heated argument. Throughout the trial, Sam remained silent. He attended every hearing, but avoided the media, refusing to speak publicly about the events that had destroyed his life. Inside, he was still grappling with the loss of his wife and the betrayal of his brother. The man who had once been the center of his world was now the reason for his pain. On October 20th, 2013, the jury delivered their verdict. Paul was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the verdict was read. Paul showed a little emotion, his face pale, as he absorbed the weight of the decision. For Hannah's family, the verdict brought some closure, but the pain of losing her remained. The life they had once known was gone, shattered by secrets, betrayal, and violence. Paul was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, the reality of his actions finally settled in. He had destroyed everything: his family, his future, and most of all, the woman he had once claimed to love. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind a community forever changed by the tragedy of Hannah Miller's death. Make sure to take a look at the next case, which is the case where a wife's secret affair with her gynecologist ends in murder. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates. Also, make sure you watch that video. Thank you.